Welcome back. Welcome back to the evening campfire. As we study the opening chapters of Genesis, I've encouraged you to set yourself in the place of the original audience who heard this for the first time around 1400 BC. You are about to enter the place that God has promised to your forefathers. To have come this far means that you have been wandering in the desert since you escaped Egypt, some 40 years by now, which is a long time. But your ancestors have been waiting even longer for this promise to be fulfilled. So as the Hebrew nation, we are gathered one last time to hear from God before we cross the river and enter into the land. And yet the challenge today is the same one that we were given 40 years ago, to trust and obey the God who made us his people. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then, when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you. For the Lord your God who is among you is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you. The Lord gave you these and many other commands to protect you and to provide for your well-being as you cross into Canaan. But you are also reminded at this moment of how precious you are to him. The Lord did not set his affection on you and chose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commands. Over the past 40 years, the God who formed you into a nation has given you his law. He has declared himself above all other gods to be worshipped, and he has revealed himself by demonstrating that he is not anything like the gods of the nations around you. He showed you his supremacy through miracles, plagues, and supernatural events, which include providing food and water for you for every day of the past 40 years. And now, as we read through this creation account, he's revealing himself in another way. The God of law, the God of provision, is also the creator God. So this is where we left off. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. In just these few verses, we have learned important lessons in theology. So let me remind you of what they are. Our God is the creator of all things. He exists apart from and above both time and matter. Our God controls the elements by the power of his word. He brings order and creates boundaries, and he is the one that defines what is good. Now, as you sit at the campfire with your relatives and friends, let's continue to find out what happens next. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. The wording of this event is so basic that any child who understands the language can figure out what's happening. And if we continue to take notes on what we're learning, then God's activity on day one can be summarized like this. God separated light from darkness. He named one day. He named the other night. So far, so good. But let's stop for a few moments and come back into the 21st century to discuss a perspective on what we've read that significantly alters its meaning and impacts what's happening on the other 5 days to come. While on face value we are reading a description of a single day, some have looked at this and determined that a day really does not refer to a day, but to an undefined period of time, a time that would allow for many, many, many years. It is known as the day-age theory. Like some of the other theories that we touched on last week, we don't have time to get into all the nuances of this perspective right now. But let me say this. At the core of the day-age theory are a couple of items that determine how you look at the text. The first one is how someone understands the use of the word day, which is yom in Hebrew. As I said, it is argued that a day does not always mean a 24-hour period, but could mean other things. That is absolutely true. Most words have more than one meaning depending on the context, both in modern language and in the Bible. Let me give you an example from Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis Ministry. Back in my father's day, it took 10 days to drive across the Australian outback during the day. In one sentence, we have the word used with 3 different meanings. And yet the context makes it clear to us which use is being employed in every instance. We find the same kind of thing going on in the Scriptures. The day of the Lord is more than one day, even though it begins at a point in time. And here's another example from Genesis 2, speaking still of creation. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and heaven. Here, the word yom is used to speak of the period where God brought creation into being, which according to Genesis is a period of 6 days. The Christian Standard Bible clarifies it even more by translating the word yom not as day, but as the intended meaning. These are the records of the heavens and the earth concerning their creation at the time the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And so we agree that day and most other words can have more than one meaning depending on the context. If a day is not a day, then millions of years is possible. The other item that determines how you look at the evidence has to do with the weight of science when interpreting God's word. The day-age theory is held by many sincere Christians who are trying to reconcile what science tells us is true with the biblical account. It's rooted in an effort to harmonize our understanding of the Bible with what appears to be overwhelming scientific evidence of an old earth. You see, if you simply follow the timeline of creation, along with the lifespans and the generations of the Old Testament patriarchs, you arrive at a universe that is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. We will look at the age of the earth issue again at some other time, but it is helpful to realize that this theory was not really a point of conversation until about the last couple hundred years. In that time, science has become the new foundation for understanding everything, including the Bible. So the paradigm that's employed most often now is this: science leads to biblical interpretation. But for believers who lived before a couple hundred years ago, it was a different foundation for studying the Scriptures. The Bible leads to scientific interpretation. You can see that your starting point has a lot to do with where you end up. And since this issue will impact other parts of what we read in the weeks ahead, let me leave you with this much. Context determines everything. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. The common understanding of the words, particularly when they appear the first time in a text, day and night, typically mean a 24-hour period. And a plain reading of Genesis 1 leads us to the same conclusion. So when you add in the last part of verse 5, there was evening and there was morning, I am left with the conclusion that one day is a real day. Just as you experienced between 6 a.m. yesterday and 6 a.m. today, or midnight to midnight, if you prefer. Verse 6. And God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. As God creates light and separates it from darkness, So God creates a division of the waters. The watery deep, if you remember from last week, which characterized chaos, comes under even greater control through the power of God's spoken word. And on day 2, God provides even more distinction. He separated the waters above and below, and he named the upper expanse, the sky, or the heavens. On day 2, he takes the water and designates part of that as a backdrop above the earth, while the other portion is placed on the earth. The upper atmosphere is spoken of here and in other places in the Old Testament as the firmament. It is a description of a barrier, like one made out of hammered metal. In our time, you might think of a tin roof. The expanse includes the sky, which is Earth's atmosphere, and outer space, which will be filled more on day 4. This expanse will play a significant role in another part of the Genesis story, but that's a ways away. So we'll get into more detail on that part another time also. Now, the younger children sitting with you at the campfire and listening with your family may not have made the connection yet, but it's probably crossed your mind. You have witnessed, on a smaller scale, how God separated the waters. You walked through the Red Sea with literal walls of water on both sides. But you notice anything else here? So far, the description is very similar to day 1, but there's something added, and it was so. This is a very strong statement. It doesn't show up very often. Unlike the division of light and darkness, which, as you think about it, actually alternates depending on the time of day, the division of the waters below and above is fixed and unchanging. And do you notice something else this time? When God separated the darkness from the light on day 1, he declared it good. There's no mention of day 2 being good. But don't worry about that. It's not good because the separation of the waters is not quite finished yet. Now, before we move on to day 3, let me remind you of one more thing that you may remember about some of the gods that you left behind you in Egypt. You see, the Egyptians believed that the sky or the heavens is the place many of their gods control and live in. But look at what your God has done on day 2. He not only created the expanse, he divided it by the power of his voice. And he not only divided the expanse, he named it as his own. He's in control and has sovereign power over the place where those false gods supposedly live. It was your God that did that, not theirs. There is no one greater than our God. Verse 9. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God separates the lower waters even further as he now collects the water, or gathers it, into oceans and seas. In each successive day, our God is bringing greater clarity to his creation. And for the first time, we have a picture of something solid, land. While we read that statement of determination, once again, it was so. Once more, the Lord fixed the boundaries between the dry land and the bodies of water, just as he determined they should be. God called the dry ground land, and he gathered the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Now it's good, because the purpose of dividing the land from the water is accomplished. And so far, God's activity on day 3 can be summarized like this. God separated the land from the seas, and he named the land and the seas. Before we read a little bit more about day 3, don't miss the significance of this most recent division between dirt and water. As you're sitting in front of the campfire, hearing these words describe all these events, what's the one thing that's been on your mind for the past 40 years? Entering the land. It's not an accident that you were promised a place of your own. In fact, the fact that you will have boundaries to mark the edges of the promised land goes back to creation order. Once again, the God that called you out of Egypt is the same good God that is providing good land for your good. The creation account itself demonstrates God's love for humanity since he has formed creation for our benefit. Now, something else may motivate you to offer praise at this point. Think for a moment about the separation between what we call land and seas. Where exactly are those dividing lines? Now, if it's not too cold, later today you can walk along one of our many Jersey beaches, and you will be able to look at the land and the sea in real life. But I dare you to show me the exact edge of the water and the beginning of the sand. You can't, but God can. He gave the sea its boundary so the waters would not overstep his command. If he did not set those boundaries, the watery chaos would engulf us. Now, day 3 has more to it than what we've just read so far. So come with me to verse 11. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Among the progress of day 3, God creates vegetation that can reproduce itself. And he made 2 types of plants, fruit-bearing and seed-bearing. Both are examples of fertility, and many will be useful for food. But once again, such division according to their kinds is considered good. But there's another lesson built into this description of the 3rd day. You see, the Egyptian gods and the gods of the nations that we're entering demand homage from their people to ensure that the crops will grow again this spring. In fact, they have elaborate rituals to induce their gods to be kind to them and produce fruit and vegetation for them. We are told that they believe their fertility gods, in some cases, even die every year, and so their fields die with them in the fall, annually. If they don't appease them, those gods may not reappear after the winter is over. So their lands will not produce crops, and they will starve. But our God provides for us out of his goodness. He doesn't operate out of whim and emotion. So we don't have to receive our fruits and vegetables by some ritual. He does it because of who he is. In fact, he has built into his good creation the process of reproduction, fertility. And he did so by decree, once again, from his spoken word. He's the Lord of light on day 1, and he's the Lord of life on day 3. So I don't have to fear that he will hold back on providing for my needs. Yet there's even one more organizational component taking place on day 3. Not only are there 2 types of plants, but we see this phrase 3 times in 3 verses, according to their kinds. Plant life has been designated and designed by God to have certain limitations, which are declared good. It explains why we can't make an apple tree produce string beans. It is so foundational to the design of creation that we will see this phrase show up again as well. But let's complete day 3 with verse 13. And there was evening and there was morning, the 3rd day. Since this is the 3rd time we've heard this phrase, let me answer a question that may have come into your minds by now. Do you notice the order is consistent each time? Evening, then morning. There's a reason for that. The Jewish perspective for the start of a day is this: a 24-hour period begins at sundown. Now, for us Westerners, we determined the new day to begin at 12:01, just after midnight. So when we speak aright, our order is reversed in order to describe another 24-hour period. But you may have noticed something else by day 3, the repetition in the descriptions. We live in a time when the majority of our residents can read and write. We have access to a nearly unlimited array of source material for us to see and copy, download, print, or have in hard form on a library shelf. In comparison, the ancient Near Eastern cultures, the people, like Israel, only had a few individuals who could claim anything close to that opportunity. And so the spoken word is critical in teaching the people about ethics, behavior, law, and who God is. And since we're not trained in the Hebrew language, we are reading the creation account in English. But even in English, we can identify that there's a pattern of repetition, and this is done so on purpose. Both the rhythm and the actual words were often used as a mnemonic device. Are you picking up on the pattern of repetition? God said, God made, God called, God saw that it was good. Now, we use mnemonic devices in our own learning all the time, like the ABC song, so you could learn the English alphabet when you were little. Acronyms are another example. Every good boy does fine for those learning to read music. Or HOMES, homes, to remember the names of the 5 Great Lakes. The scriptures use repetition and similar sounds between words for a very simple reason: to remember God's commands. Now, since we're not hearing or reading the Old Testament in the original language, we don't always appreciate the use of those memory aids. But for the original listeners, such devices allowed them to hold on to what they were hearing, since they did not have a copy of the Old Testament to read whenever they wanted to. That's the one reason they gathered many times a year to listen to the scriptures proclaimed. Without those opportunities to meet up, the people could go weeks or months without hearing anything of God's word. Now, I won't do justice to the Hebrew, but you can get the idea anyway. Amar, Asa, Kara, Ra'ah. The repeating sounds and phrases help us to hold on to what we're learning. And yet behind the pattern is something bigger as far as a theological teaching goes, concerning the nature and the character of our God. You see, every time that God speaks, as we're walking through these first chapters, creation takes on clearer form. The separating, the gathering, the sorting activities of our Creator are all part of His work in bringing order out of chaos. To better appreciate the ordering of God, let me take you back to the opening verses again. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Now that we've read a little further into beyond chapter or verse 2, we see that this description has 2 different yet related conditions. The creation was without boundaries and without content. So the first 3 days have described the process of creating shape, form, distinctions. He separated light from darkness on day 1. He separated the waters above from the waters below on day 2, shaping the sea and the sky. And on day 3, he gathered the lower waters into the seas and created the land. Then he fixed their boundaries and spoke earth's fertility into existence by bringing plants and trees up from the ground, making the earth fruitful and ready for life. God's activity in bringing order is an expression of his complete domain over the universe. And beginning with one day, or day 1, we are introduced to another aspect of God's dominion. Now, let me point out for you to see what the Lord is actually doing in this very simple activity that we would normally just blow over when we see it. Ever since I first recognized this topic as an area of study, it has continued to fascinate me, and I've continued to look at it for many years, especially as I look at the world around us using the same approach to life. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. From a biblical worldview, the action of giving something a name is an expression of oversight. The one who creates something is the one who gets to name it. God did the same on day 2 and day 3. And up to the present moment, isn't it interesting that we still understand what sky, land, and sea are supposed to be and what they mean? Now, since this action will continue from this point forward, I'd like to lay down at least one foundational block for us to understand this concept of naming and appreciate it. The act of naming is an act of sovereign dominion. In the Old Testament, naming captures the essential nature of a person or a thing. So to name is to have knowledge and control over something or someone. Of course, we could give a different name to the sky, land, sea, day, or night. But that will not change the essence of what they are. God determines their meaning and their purpose as the Lord of creation. So when God names something, it's an expression of both his ownership and his protection of it. The boundaries that he places on each one of them demonstrates his desire to preserve them for their intended purpose. To alter or redefine that purpose, we call perversion. And it is actually a challenge to what God has decided, and it was so. Sometimes when you have a few moments to yourself, I invite you to meditate on this one aspect of God's oversight. And read over Genesis 1 and 2 and the chapters that follow that as well. And just see how often you see something close to this in the Old Testament. And God called or God named. As we're going to learn a bit later in the first chapter, humans have been created in the image of God. As such, we have certain traits that correlate with him that are built into our DNA. As part of his creation design, he has given us oversight of many things. We are his representatives for the rest of creation. So let me ask you a couple of questions to help you appreciate this topic a little further. Why do parents get to name their children? Why are people upset when someone mocks their name or gives them another one? Now, I know the world is looking for a psychological or sociological answer to that kind of a question. My habit is to always look for a theological one. So let me offer a few things to consider as we think more biblically. Why do parents get to name their children? Just as God is sovereign over all of us, he delegated certain oversight to parents. It is why the fifth commandment is in place. Part of parental oversight is the responsibility and the privilege of giving a name to your child. Now, I'm not sure that the average young couple is even thinking in these terms. But when your firstborn is on the way and you're discussing name options with your spouse, you are reflecting God's creation design for the family. It's a holy act on some level. The name you give then becomes a defining part of who that child is. And in most cases, it lasts a lifetime. Why are people upset when someone mocks their name or gives them another one? You remember when you were a kid and someone called you a name that wasn't yours? Or purposely mispronounced your name, if you have one of those that's, you didn't like it. You may have even gotten angry and punched the guy in the face. Why was that? Aren't they just words? You know, sticks and stones and all that. Let me offer you some things to consider. First, you are God's creation. He has sovereignty over you, even if you're not aware of it. Other people don't. So something doesn't set right in the deepest part of you when your name is ignored, belittled, or replaced. And as I just alluded to, your name is a key part of your identity, given to you at birth by your parents as God's delegated authority. That is who you are. So when someone mocks your name or gives you a name out of anger or hatred, such words fly in the face of God's design. And in your deepest soul, you feel the violation that something's out of order. When God names something, he is demonstrating his sovereignty over that thing or that person. And as this theme unfolds in Genesis, we will see that God's activity of naming does not just include his oversight and ownership. It's even better. It also includes his protection and care, because naming is an expression of relationship. I remember the moment that the relational aspect in a theological world became very real for me in my life. My sister and I were meeting up at a Dunkin' Donuts for breakfast. This was years ago. And by that point in our lives, my dad had been succumbing to Alzheimer's disease for many years. But not long before my sister and I met up that day, I had visited the family for some celebration, and yet my last encounter with my dad was very different from all the others. I knew that he still recognized me, but I also realized that he could not remember the name that he and my mom had given me. And it was at that moment that I realized this simple missing piece, the name, meant that our relationship would never be the same. Naming is an expression of relationship. I believe it's another reason we feel slighted when after a dozen or so conversations with someone, you know that person still doesn't know your name. On the opposite end, when someone speaks your name, they know you. And when someone you look up to knows your name, you know that you're included and have value in that person's eyes. The first 3 days are days of forming. God demonstrates his power over all things by his activity in this first phase of creation. The day and night obey his commands. They rise and fall based on his will. The seas will not inch past the boundaries that he has set for them. The plants and the trees mature and can reproduce as part of his design. It is all good. And when we meet up again, we'll look at the next 3 days. Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us an opportunity to get together today, to look at your opening chapters once again, to take our time processing what we see in the simplicity of the language. And Father, I pray that you'd help us to wrestle with the things that we've heard and have learned as we come back to your word as the final authority to try to sort all that out. Help us as we wrestle with what we have known about the creation from the world of science, in many cases getting it right, in many cases not getting it right. Help us to be discerning. Give us faith to allow your word to speak for itself, to come under that, and to alter our thinking and worldview as a result of it. And thank you for being a good God that brings good things for the good of your people. Help us to remember that when the day is dark or the moment is going sideways, that you are a God that loves us, you created us, you have a purpose for us, and you desire always what is our best. Amen.